The Gallipoli campaign remains one of the most infamous military operations of World War I, a brutal and costly engagement that resulted in little strategic gain and heavy losses for the Allied forces. Yet, amid the carnage and tactical failures, there was one moment of brilliance that turned what could have been a devastating massacre into a remarkable success. The so-called Gallipoli trick, a masterful deception that allowed Allied troops to retreat without suffering catastrophic losses, has gone down in history as one of the greatest military feints ever executed. At the heart of this deception was an extraordinarily simple yet ingenious device, the drip rifle. This invention, created by an Australian soldier, gave the illusion that Allied soldiers were still in the trenches long after they had begun their withdrawal, buying them crucial time to evacuate without the Ottomans realizing they had vanished. What followed was not only one of the smoothest withdrawals in military history but also a testament to the power of intelligence, ingenuity, and psychological warfare. By late 1915, it had become painfully clear that the Gallipoli campaign was a failure. What was originally intended as a swift invasion to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war had turned into a grinding stalemate. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French forces had landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula with the aim of securing a strategic victory, but they soon found themselves trapped in a brutal deadlock. The Ottoman defenders, led by the brilliant General Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, had held their ground fiercely, repelling repeated attacks with devastating efficiency. The terrain was unforgiving, the trenches were miserable, and the casualties on both sides were staggering. Disease, exhaustion, and relentless combat had taken a severe toll on the Allied troops, and after months of bloodshed, it was clear that continuing the fight was futile. The only logical decision was to retreat. However, a traditional withdrawal posed a grave risk. In wartime, a retreating army is at its most vulnerable, and history had shown that such movements often resulted in heavy losses. If the Ottomans realized the Allies were pulling out, they could launch a massive counterattack, overwhelming the remaining troops and turning the evacuation into a bloodbath. To avoid this disaster, Allied commanders devised a strategy that relied on deception. The key was to make the enemy believe that nothing had changed, that the trenches were still occupied and that the defensive positions were as strong as ever. This required a ruse that would not only fool Ottoman scouts but also withstand close observation for long enough to ensure a safe withdrawal. The solution came from William Scurry, an Australian soldier who devised a simple but brilliant invention, the drip rifle. This device used two tins, one filled with water and another empty, attached to a rifle's trigger mechanism. A small hole in the top tin allowed water to drip slowly into the lower one. Over time, as the lower tin filled with water, it became heavier and eventually triggered the rifle's firing mechanism. When multiple drip rifles were set up to fire at random intervals, it created the illusion of continuous activity in the trenches, making it appear as though the Allied troops were still holding their positions even as they slipped away in the darkness. The deception was carried out with remarkable precision. Over the course of several nights in December 1915 and January 1916, the evacuation took place in carefully coordinated phases. Soldiers were gradually withdrawn in small groups, minimizing the risk of detection. The remaining troops maintained normal routines to avoid arousing suspicion, lighting fires, moving supplies, and creating noise to make it seem as if nothing had changed. Dummy figures were placed in key positions to further sell the illusion, and the drip rifles continued firing sporadically, maintaining the facade of an active battlefield. The Ottomans, believing that the Allies were still present in full force, did not advance. The final night of the evacuation was the most critical. A small rearguard force remained behind to oversee the last stage of the deception, ensuring that the Ottomans remained unaware of the withdrawal until the very last moment. As the final soldiers slipped away under the cover of darkness, the drip rifles continued to fire, echoing through the trenches and keeping the illusion alive. By the time the last Allied troops had safely boarded their transport ships, the Ottomans were still none the wiser. It was only hours later, when they finally advanced and found the trenches empty, that they realized they had been deceived. By then, it was too late, the Allies were gone. The success of the Gallipoli evacuation stood in stark contrast to the disastrous campaign that preceded it. While the invasion had been a catastrophic failure, the retreat was a masterpiece of strategic deception. Unlike so many previous battles where withdrawals had led to heavy casualties, the Allies managed to escape with almost no losses. The combination of careful planning, psychological warfare, and the ingenious drip rifle turned what could have been a massacre into a near-flawless retreat. Although the Gallipoli campaign remains one of the great tragedies of World War I, the trick that allowed the Allies to escape without heavy casualties has become legendary. Military historians study it as an example of how deception and psychological warfare can achieve what brute force cannot. The drip rifle itself, though a rudimentary invention, represents the kind of battlefield ingenuity that can turn the tide of war. It proved that intelligence, rather than sheer firepower, could be the deciding factor in a military operation. Had the evacuation failed, thousands of Allied soldiers could have been slaughtered, further compounding the disaster of Gallipoli. Instead, the retreat became one of the most successful operations of the war, a rare victory in an otherwise futile campaign. The Ottomans may have won the battle, but the Allies had executed a tactical masterpiece that allowed them to fight another day. The Gallipoli trick remains one of the most fascinating moments in military history, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the art of deception in warfare.